This episode of the ISACA Podcast is proudly sponsored by Williams Adley. At Williams Adley, we help federal, state, and local clients address today's most pressing challenges: managing risk, enhancing cybersecurity resilience, and navigating complex regulatory landscapes. In times of change, we provide the insight agencies need to move forward with confidence and clarity, whether it's audit and assurance, cybersecurity risk management, or advisory solutions. Our services are built to support every stage of an organization's mission. And with a reputation for providing trusted guidance and personable service for the past 40-plus years, we are a strong partner for agencies of every size. Williams Adley, we deliver clarity, accountability, and confidence to government programs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Cook, and I'm the Principal GRC Research Analyst at ISACA. Today, we have Patrick Bevill, the CISO at Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. Patrick, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa, and good afternoon. I am Patrick Bevill, as Lisa said, and the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board manages the federal and military retirement plans. Most people know us by our product, which is the Thrift Savings Plan. We have approaching 8 million participants and beneficiaries and over $1 trillion in assets. And so I like to call us a small agency with a big job. I've been doing this job at the FRTIB for coming up on 7 years now.
Excellent. Well, today we're here to talk about breaking the compliance mentality. And I wanted to kick us off with a question. From your perspective, what does the tone at the top mean in the context of cybersecurity and information assurance within a federal agency?
Sure. And, I'm really passionate about this topic. Breaking the compliance mentality actually was job number one at the FRTIB when I landed there. And the tone at the top is absolutely critical to helping break that compliance mentality. To me, it's not just tone as in what you say, right? But it's the character of what you say. For example, proactive rather than passive. And tone is also, not just what you say, but it's also follow through, right? It's what you do. And so, the messaging from the top needs to be consistent, clear, proactive, and there needs to be visible follow through so that the organization knows that you're not just giving lip service, right, to some new construct. Like I said, for me, if you want to change compliance mentality, tone at the top is kind of the seed that gets you started. And you're not going to get very far without it. If you try to affect organizational change without top cover or support from your leadership team, you won't get far and you won't have lasting results. So again, just to reiterate, tone is not just what you say, it's how you say it, right? It needs to be proactive. It needs to be on point. It needs to be relevant. Specificity is good, right? And coming from the leadership, right? Not just sort of general concepts, but actual specificity and how it applies to what, you, the listener, do in your daily life and your daily work. And then finally, the key is absolutely follow through. That's visible support of the messaging that you're putting out, shown by actions.
Oh, absolutely. It's so important. And I think one of the key words you use is proactive. And when we think a little bit about the topic today, breaking the compliance mentality, it really turns into a shift from meeting minimum requirements to really being proactive, as you say, in risk management. So tell me, if often, is it easy to default to compliance as a measure of success? What are the risks of a compliance-only mentality, and how can leaders begin shifting their teams toward a risk-based mindset?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for starters, you've probably heard the old saying that if you take care of best practices, compliance will take care of itself, right?
Uh-huh.
Unfortunately, the reverse is not true. right? If you focus on compliance, best practices don't necessarily follow. And I think, it is almost all too easy to fall into that compliance mentality. Some people call it the checkbox mentality. Yes, I've met these requirements as prescribed by my IG or regulator or NIST or whoever it is, right, that's providing their checklist. It is all too easy. And I think it's because the requirements there are clear. They're often more static. So it's easier to track towards, progress on pure compliance requirements if they evolve slowly. But the truth is that, cybersecurity, the threat landscape, and the nature of cybersecurity operations, actually defending your enterprise, is way more fluid than that. So what happens is when you focus on compliance only, you end up with a misallocation of resources. I can tell you, I've seen federal agencies whose IT security personnel spend more time responding to auditors than actually doing operational cybersecurity. That's a classic misallocation of resources. And that's one of the, symptoms of an over-reliance on compliance. We were talking about the tone at the top earlier, and I think that tendency to fall into the compliance mentality can definitely be a product of the tone at the top. If the tone at the top is just wanting to see, well, how did you do on your FISMA audits? Or, are our vendors submitting clean SOC 2 Type 2 reports? All of those things can be foundational, right, to measuring sort of the baseline cybersecurity capabilities of an organization. But you can't just focus on and measure compliance. There are plenty of other outcomes, especially as related to cybersecurity operations, right, that you have to also measure. And so, again, that tone at the top needs to shift, right, from, well, we do care about compliance because it's foundational. However, there are other characteristics of the cybersecurity mission, and there are other much more fast-paced things than compliance and audits that the team needs to be focused on. And there was a last part to your question there, Lisa. What was it?
Well, I was just talking a little bit about that shift in the mindset that people need to make, and how do we go about doing that? One of the things, because we were talking about proactive risk management, right, versus that compliance, or that you mentioned checklist or ticking the box type of mentality. It seems like that would require a shift in the culture, and that goes back to the tone at the top, right? Going from that point in time assessment of ticking the box to that cultural shift of being more proactive. Would you agree?
Yeah, I totally agree, Lisa. And I think, a part of the issue is that, if you're hearing from the leadership team that, compliance matters, and then they don't elaborate, right, and say, oh, and also these other things matter, then you clearly get the message that, compliance is what we need to be focused on. Part of the messaging and the tone from the top needs to be, well, if I don't focus on compliance first and I just do what I think is the right thing, I won't get in trouble, right? And I'll have the opportunity to explain why I believe that engaging in this practice instead meets the objective of whatever the compliance requirement is. However, isn't as explicit as providing the documentation that proves that I can check that box, right? And I think this is the key, is that empowering your teams to understand that they have the ability to make risk appropriate decisions to implement cybersecurity practices. And then, like I said at the beginning, focusing on best practices in a risk appropriate way will help compliance sort itself out, as long as you can explain to the folks who are interested in compliance and to your auditors how it is that your behavior is risk appropriate and meets the spirit of the compliance requirements.
Absolutely. Is there any advice that you would give to CISOs or agency leaders who want to strengthen their tone at the top and build a culture that goes beyond compliance?
Yeah, I think, first, don't bury your head in the sand, right? If that's, if there's a problem, you need to hit it head on. And first and foremost, we've been talking about the importance of leadership support. So the key problem here is managing up, right? If you want to start to change the mentality, if you want to influence agency leadership, this is a classic problem of managing up. And that means that sometimes you're in the position of having to mentor your own leaders, right, about, the concepts of cybersecurity maturity and your take on the most appropriate ways to measure it. And that's, in a lot of respects, that's teaching a board a new language. And, let's face it, my agency is in the financial services sector. I have a board of really wonderful people who are experts, right, in the financial services sector, in the retirement business, and especially the defined contribution retirement space. And they know that end of the business backwards and forwards. Do they know cybersecurity? Well, they're aware that there can be problems, and they're aware that our regulator is very interested, right, in whether we comply with their requirements. But they often lack the language to describe the outcomes that they expect to see. And you need to make sure that they understand the value to the business, right, of the cybersecurity operation. And that's also involves, kind of reframing their thinking about cybersecurity, not just as a cost center, right, but as something that adds business value, even if it's only just avoiding costs associated with things like incidents and breaches and things like that.
Right.
So yeah, I think, first and foremost, manage up, frame the problems to your leaders as business problems that can be solved with cybersecurity maturity as your goal. And, change that mentality of cyber being a cost center, compliance being, the thing that drives the activity of that cost center, to cybersecurity is a business value add. They contribute to the mission. And, in a way, they protect your top line, right? And your bottom line at the same, like I said, didn't say that, right? They protect your bottom line, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's it. I think it's basically just framing it in business terms. So in a way, that's partly on you as a cybersecurity practitioner. You need to try to understand how to describe business value, right, and speak that language, and avoid all of the jargon that we all tend to lapse into when we speak to each other. Mm-hmm. And then just ensure that there's understanding, right, at the leadership level. Ensure that there's understanding across the workforce of how their activities tie to the mission, right, of the organization and how they add business value. Mm-hmm. And I think, if you would start to address those fundamentals, that's when you start to get traction on organizational change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm thinking a little bit about, as I listen to you, I think a little bit about some of these more qualitative type measures, all right? Culture, behavior, and that tone of the top, being able to communicate to that level of management. And I start thinking a little bit about the metrics that might be used to measure security culture. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a strong preference for using the NIST cybersecurity framework mm-hmm. and cybersecurity framework maturity as a measure. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the NIST cybersecurity framework is extremely flexible. I think if you compare it to other security frameworks, I think it's maybe a little more straightforward and easier to explain, especially the way that it ties to the business because of, the presence of governance functions in it. And the fact that it's really tied to organizational capabilities and outcomes, mm-hmm. right? As opposed to other regulatory frameworks, which might be about, defining a target or a system boundary and then imposing controls on that boundary. That's about systems and controls, whereas the CSF is about capabilities and outcomes. And I think that that's a much easier sort of conversation to have with your leadership is about, if we have X capability, then we'll achieve Y outcomes. And by the way, the cost of X is, and then the value of Y is, right? And you start to make those connections. Another reason why I have a preference for the NIST cybersecurity framework is that adoption is quite high in the financial services sector, which is where I operate. The cybersecurity framework was meant to be a sort of a Rosetta Stone, right? That translates between various compliance frameworks and federal requirements. You can map, for example, ISO, 27,000 or COBIT, or you pick your flavor of security framework. You can map using the NIST cybersecurity framework. You can map that to federal requirements, right, such as NIST, and that's one of the really valuable things about it. Because regulators in the financial services sector are also measuring the cybersecurity maturity of the organizations they regulate using the NIST cybersecurity framework, adoption has been quite high. And so that's an instance in which I think our regulators has really kind of moved the ball forward in giving us all sort of a uniform language that we can use to talk across the federal government and the private sector. And then, between us and our regulators and our auditors. The FISMA audits, for example, are organized along the lines of the cybersecurity framework. And the goal of the FISMA audit is to measure the cybersecurity maturity of an organization within, the lens of that framework. And so I think, we're already being measured that way in a FISMA compliance sense. And I think their organizational performance can also be measured that way. And there's one last benefit that I think I'll add that I think maybe auditors will appreciate it. And that is that if you have a robust implementation of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and given that FISMA audits are conducted along the lines of the cybersecurity framework, you are also kind of future-proofing yourself against future audit requirements. Right? Because, for example, if a new domain is added in the FISMA audit, if it's mapped to the NIST cybersecurity framework, well, you've kind of already done that work, right? You're already ready. And so for those reasons, the NIST cybersecurity framework is really my favorite way to measure. And it's specifically, cybersecurity framework maturity, but it's also because it's outcome-based measurement, which is easier to tie to business value.
Absolutely. That value really has to tie back with those strategies that you talked about earlier. And you also talked about the future. So as we think about the next 3 to 5 years, for example, and keeping on theme with tone at the top, and as cyber threats evolve, how do you see that tone at the top shaping cybersecurity strategies over time?
Yeah, I honestly think, Lisa, that the biggest shift in tone is going to be about urgency. Simply because the nature of the threat is accelerating, the pace of IT operations and cybersecurity operations that's required to meet the threat is accelerating. When you're talking about things like AI, all right, and AI-enabled cybersecurity attacks, that means that people defending the organization, right, your cybersecurity defenders, your incident responders, your vulnerability managers, all of those folks need to up their game. Ultimately, they're going to need to be operating at machine speed, just like their adversaries are. And, really what I'm predicting is going to happen is that the role of the human cybersecurity defender is going to become more about managing the performance of agentic AI and the defense of the organization, as opposed to making human-in-the-loop decisions, right, that are assisted by AI. And the reason why is because the pace will be such that humans in the loop, those processes, they'll break. Humans can't be fast enough, right, to respond. And the more places you're relying on humans for decision-making, the riskier, all right, that proposition is. And so, one thing that you can do, I guess, maybe to prep for the future is look for some low-hanging fruit. Is there something that I can agentify in my SOC operations right now that I can offload from a human? Well, yeah, sure. Look at the 400 or 500, 600, whatever it is, reports of phishing email that you get on a daily basis that you have to go investigate. Well, that's a good target for agentic AI, right, to go and evaluate, is this or isn't this, a phishing email, and then take that analysis to a human who can determine, well, do I need to respond to this? Or did the agentic AI do a good job of triaging this, and did it come to the correct conclusions? Do I need to make any changes to the model so that it's more accurate? Those are the sorts of concerns that I see emerging in the future. So it's really going to be all about pace. It's going to be about leveraging the technology, especially agentic AI, and being able to proactively manage vulnerabilities, right? So the time from disclosure of a vulnerability to patching, right, and the time for an exploit to be developed used to be on the order of months, and now it's on the order of about 20 hours, right, using agentic AI. The prediction is that by the end of this year, it may be as little as 10 minutes. That doesn't give organizations very much time to respond. And so I think that the art of vulnerability management will turn to sort of continuous scanning of your environment using AI to seek vulnerabilities, which is very different from what we're doing today. And then, AI will have to be able to assist in the defense. For example, is there some way that I can mitigate or virtually patch a vulnerability before an actual patch is available from the vendor or whatever software has the vulnerability? So I hope that's helpful in kind of trying to lay out what I think the future looks like. I think in some respects it's more of the same, but faster. But in a lot of respects, it has to be transformational in the sense that you need to implement new tools, change your workforce to be focused more on using AI as a force multiplier, and be prepared for the future by making your job about managing the effectiveness of the AI that you're using in defense of your organization.
Oh, absolutely. And just as we wind down, this has been a very informative session. You talked about agentic AI, and that goes back to that compliance mentality needing to shift, right? Needing to be able to respond on the dime, not at human speed, but at machine speed. And your examples with vulnerability management are just so spot on. But it also ties back to that checklist that we talked about at the top of the discussion, right? We can't be doing a point in time assessment and consider that to be compliance anymore. So it really does talk about the shift in thinking.
Absolutely right. Point in time assessments expire as soon as they're done, right? Everything has to be continuous. And then to tie it back to the tone at the top, like I mentioned, I think the tone at the top needs to be a sense of urgency, but not panic, right? We don't want anybody to panic, but urgency in the sense that we must move quickly, and not panic inducing in the sense that, the leadership needs to communicate, hey, we've got you. Let us know what resources are required, what tools you need to pick up the pace in this, shifting cyber threat landscape. So that's really going to be the shift in tone.
Sounds good. Well, that's all the time that we have for right now. I really want to thank Patrick again for joining us to have this very important discussion and talking to us about how to break that compliance mentality and shift that tone at the top. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.